feel like I really understand that we have a responsibility to change the narrative around what we are delivering to young people in the classroom. But I would describe the actual day-to-day learning side of things very challenging.
He wasn't supposed to be interesting. That's usually how it goes with the men who marry into the British royal family. They show up in a morning suit, stand quietly to one side, smile for the cameras, and disappear into the background of history books as the husband of. Nobody expected the guy in the well-cut blazer with a property portfolio and the Italian surname nobody could pronounce on the first try to come with his own baggage, his own title, his own scandal-adjacent past, and eventually his own front-row seat to one of the messiest royal falls from grace in modern memory. But that's exactly what happened when Princess Beatrice fell for Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi. This is the story of a man who is, on paper, a count, who built a property empire before he turned 30, who has a son from a broken engagement that ended right around the time he started falling for a princess, who got married in a ceremony so small and so quiet that most of Britain didn't know it had happened until it was already over, and who has spent the last several years standing next to a woman whose father has become one of the most notorious figures in the entire royal family's history. Let's get into it. Start with the name, because the name alone tells you this isn't a standard-issue London businessman. Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi. Say a few times, and it starts to sound less like the name of a modern property developer and more like something out of an old European portrait gallery. That's not an accident. The Mapelli Mozzi family holds a hereditary Italian title, Count of the Kingdom of Italy, dating back to a grant made in 1913 under King Victor Emmanuel III to male descendants of the line. Italy did away with its monarchy in 1946 and abolished the legal standing of noble titles along with it. But families with centuries of history rarely let go of that identity just because a government changed its mind about who gets to use count on a business card. The Mapelli Mozzis reportedly trace their ancestry back even further to a son of the 13th century Sicilian King Frederick II, a lineage that predates most of the nations we think of as fixed points on a map. The family still owns Villa Mapelli Mozzi in northern Italy, a 15th century estate that began life as a monastery before it was eventually turned into a luxury retreat. So while the tabloids like to frame Edoardo as an outsider who married up into royalty, the truth is closer to two different kinds of old-world status colliding. One built on land and titles going back generations, the other built on constitutional monarchy and a modern British crown. None of which stopped him from also being a fully modern, working professional. He went to the Dragon School in Oxford, then Radley College, and later picked up a master's degree in politics from the University of Edinburgh. By his early 20s, he'd already founded Bonda Property, a high-end development and interior design firm serving London's wealthiest buyers, and he's been public about being dyslexic, something he and Beatrice actually share, and something he said pushed him toward the visual, spatial thinking that shaped his design career instead of a more traditional academic path. Bonda Property launched in 2007, when Edoardo was 23, built on a fairly simple premise. Find pockets of London that were undervalued, turn them into striking high-end homes, and sell them to buyers who could afford exactly that kind of striking. By the time he and Beatrice were being photographed together on red carpets, Bonda had reportedly overseen developments worth more than $800 million. The company built a reputation for sleek, almost theatrical interiors, and Edoardo leaned into that identity publicly. His social media functions as a running catalog of glossy interiors that look more like boutique hotels than places people actually live in day to day. He's also never been shy about having opinions, which is unusual for someone orbiting the royal family. Ahead of the 2016 London mayoral race, he wrote an op-ed pushing for more redevelopment in central London, and he's used his personal social media to criticize UK and US politicians by name, including publicly supporting Hillary Clinton on the night of the 2016 US election. That kind of open political commentary sits oddly next to the traditionally careful, apolitical silence expected of people who marry into the royal family, and it's one of the things that's made him a more unusual figure than the standard-issue commoner spouse. The business hasn't been without its stumbles, either. Property commentators pushed back when Bonda described a Notting Hill project as undervalued, pointing out that Notting Hill is one of the most expensive postcodes in the country, a case where the marketing language didn't quite match the reality. And in Australia, Bondi was linked to a planned luxury beachfront development on the Gold Coast that was promoted heavily before the company behind it collapsed into administration. It was a real setback, and the timing, reports of the collapse breaking around the same time Edoardo was attending a design conference in Palm Beach, didn't exactly help the optics. But by most accounts, he kept moving. Bondi kept building. That pattern, public setback, quiet continuation, no dramatic reinvention narrative, turns out to be a pretty consistent theme in how Edoardo handles pretty much everything that goes wrong around him. Here's the part of the story that tends to surprise people who only know Edoardo as Beatrice's husband. Before there was a princess, there was Dara Huang, an American, Harvard-educated architect with a successful international career of her own. The two got engaged around 2014 and had a son together in 2016, Christopher Wolf Mapelli Mozzi, known to basically everyone as Wolfie. By 2018, the engagement was over. Neither Edoardo nor Dara has ever gone into detail publicly about why the relationship ended, which is honestly rarer than it should be given how much royal-adjacent gossip tends to get aired. What's known is that they separated, share custody of Wolfie, and that Dara went on to build her own design firm, HB Design Group. The timing of what came next raised some eyebrows. Within months of the split, Edoardo was already seeing someone new, someone whose last name was Windsor. Nobody has ever confirmed publicly whether the relationships overlapped, and speculation about royal timelines has a way of running well ahead of actual facts. So it's worth treating that particular detail as gossip rather than established history. What matters more is what happened afterward. Wolfie didn't disappear from the picture. He became part of Beatrice and Edoardo's life together. And by most public accounts, Beatrice has embraced the role of stepmother fully and warmly. The co-parenting arrangement between Dara and Edoardo appears to have stayed genuinely amicable. The two have both been seen posting about family trips involving Wolfie at different times without apparent friction. It's a quietly unusual outcome for a story that could easily have curdled into a much messier custody narrative, and it ends up shaping a lot of what makes the eventual Mapelli Mozzi household distinctive, a blended family that never really tried to hide the blending. Edoardo was born on November 19, 1983, in London. His father, Alessandro Mapelli Mozzi, has one of those backstories that sounds almost invented. Born in Argentina, raised in Italy, educated in England, and good enough at alpine skiing to represent Great Britain at the 1972 Winter Olympics before reinventing himself as an international art dealer. His mother, Nikki Williams Ellis, built her own career across politics, charity work, and design, and later remarried, giving Edoardo a half-brother. His stepfather, Christopher Shale, died in 2011, and Edoardo has spoken about channeling that grief into charitable work, including co-founding an effort that helped build Rwanda's first grass cricket pitch. The route to Beatrice wasn't a chance meeting. It was decades in the making. The Mapelli Mozzi family and the Yorks, Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, have been close for years, something both families have confirmed publicly. When the engagement was announced in 2019, Nikki Williams Ellis said her family had known Beatrice for most of her life. These were family friends who'd likely crossed paths at the same parties and events for 2 decades before anything romantic developed. Something shifted around September 2018, not long after Edoardo's engagement to Dara ended, and a couple of years after Beatrice's own long relationship with Dave Clark had ended in 2016. The press caught up to it by November 2018. Their first confirmed public appearance as a couple came in March 2019 at a fundraising event at the National Portrait Gallery. 2 months later, they attended Lady Gabriella Windsor's wedding together, and by September 2019, Edoardo proposed in Italy, using a custom ring he'd designed himself with British jeweler Sean Lean, a baguette-cut diamond set in a floral design. Buckingham Palace confirmed the engagement on September 26, 2019. The original plan was a proper royal event, a ceremony at the Chapel Royal at St. James's Palace in May 2020, followed by a reception in the gardens of Buckingham Palace. That plan didn't survive contact with reality. First came Prince Andrew's now infamous November 2019 BBC interview, in which his attempt to explain his friendship with the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein went badly enough that he stepped back from royal duties almost immediately. That fallout landed on his daughters, and Beatrice's wedding planning was scaled back as a result. Then came the pandemic, which shut down the original venue plans entirely. When Beatrice and Edoardo finally married on July 17, 2020, it was in a small, private ceremony at the Royal Chapel of All Saints at Royal Lodge in Windsor, with only immediate family present. There was no advance public announcement. Most of the country found out it had happened after the fact. And yet the day carried some genuinely historic weight anyway. Beatrice wore a vintage ivory gown originally made for Queen Elizabeth II by Norman Hartnell in 1962, along with the same diamond fringe tiara the Queen had worn at her own wedding in 1947. Prince Andrew walked her down the aisle, but was left out of the official wedding portraits, a detail widely read as a deliberate effort to keep the day about the couple rather than about her father's unfolding scandal. After the wedding, the couple settled first into a 4-bedroom apartment at St. James's Palace, modest by royal standards, if not by anyone else's. Neither of them holds the status of a working royal, which means no official public duties and no state funding tied to their lifestyle. Beatrice works as Vice President of Strategic Partnerships at the software company Affinity. Edoardo runs Bonda. In late 2022, the family moved again into a 6-bedroom converted farmhouse in the Cotswolds, splitting their time between London during the school year and the countryside on weekends. Their first child together, Sienna Elizabeth Mapelli Mozzi, was born in September 2021 at Chelsea and Westminster Hospital and christened at the Chapel Royal in April 2022. A second daughter, Athena Elizabeth Rose Mapelli Mozzi, arrived several weeks premature on January 22, 2025, weighing just over 4 pounds. Beatrice later wrote about the experience in Vogue, describing the anxiety of learning her daughter would likely arrive early, and she went on to take up a patronage with Born, a charity focused on preventing premature birth, something she's described as personal rather than ceremonial. Athena was christened at the Chapel Royal in December 2025 and celebrated her first birthday quietly in January 2026, alongside her older sister Sienna and her 9-year-old half-brother Wolfie. No account of this family is complete without reckoning with what's happened to Beatrice's father, because it has shaped nearly every public chapter of her marriage. Jeffrey Epstein's shadow never really left Andrew, even after the 2019 interview. Renewed attention on his ties to Epstein built through 2025, fed in part by newly surfaced documents and Virginia Giuffre's posthumous memoir, in which she alleged Andrew had sexually assaulted her as a teenager, allegations he has continued to deny. The consequences arrived in dramatic fashion. On October 30th, 2025, Buckingham Palace announced that King Charles III had begun the formal process of stripping his brother of all titles and honors, including Prince and Duke of York. He is now known simply as Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. The same announcement confirmed he would be forced to give up his lease at Royal Lodge, where he had lived for over 2 decades, and move to private accommodation on the Sandringham estate, funded privately by the king. By early 2026, he had left Royal Lodge, and in February 2026, he was arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office. A stunning escalation for a man who only a few years earlier had still been a working member of the royal family. Through all of it, Beatrice and Eugenie have kept their own royal titles, reportedly under an arrangement dating back to King George V 1917 letters patent, which ties their titles to their status as granddaughters of the sovereign rather than to their father's standing. They've continued to appear at family events, including church services at Christmas, even as their father has been excluded. It's a genuinely difficult position, neither publicly defending their father nor visibly cutting him off, especially given that he did walk Beatrice down the aisle at her wedding. And through this entire stretch of scandal, arrests, and eviction notices, Edoardo's public posture hasn't changed much. He's kept working, kept attending industry events, including, at one point, a lunch at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Belgravia while Epstein-related headlines were still swirling. and kept showing up beside Beatrice at public engagements, including her first public appearance after Athena's premature birth, at a fundraising gala where she announced her new charity patronage. As of the middle of 2026, Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi is in his early 40s, running a global property and design business, married to a princess, father to 3 children across 2 households, and, somewhat improbably, given everything swirling around his in-laws, one of the least controversial figures in the entire extended royal family. He continues to represent Bonda at international design events, keeps his mother close by basing part of the family's life in Oxfordshire, and by most outside accounts has stayed a steady, low-drama presence for a family that has had very little peace over the last several years. Beatrice, for her part, remains 9th in line to the British throne, holds down an actual corporate job, is stepmother to Wolfie, mother to Sienna and Athena, and has continued to speak publicly, carefully, but directly, about premature birth and family life, even as the fallout from her father's scandal continues to unfold in real time. Strip away the tabloid framing, and what's left is a genuinely unusual modern family. An Italian count who never leaned on the title. A business built and rebuilt through very public wins and very public setbacks. A blended household that includes a remarkably civil co-parenting arrangement. And a marriage that has had to weather one of the most consequential scandals in the modern royal family's history without becoming part of the scandal itself. Whatever else is true about Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi, the through line of his story so far is consistency, showing up again and again through very good years and very bad ones without much apparent need to perform either. That, more than the title or the property portfolio, might be the real story here.